This is a Lovecraftian horror novel from our very own story curator. We can put him on the map by simply pre-ordering the book at the link below. I'm going to put that in the comments section and pin it, so just click on that, go pre-order the book, and even leave a review. And if you do, don't forget to mention Booze and Booze. I would greatly appreciate it if you did that, and I know Zach would too. Or you listen to the episode or after the episode, just simply go over there, pre-order the book, and leave a review. Thank you so much, and let's get into today's episode, shall we? I still remember the day that we lost Jared. It was the summer of 1991. I was 12, a Boy Scout with an eager heart and worn-down boots, ready to just take on the world. It was my first actual real camping experience away from home. And our troop was headed to Mount San Gorgonio for the weekend. That mountain, which is 11,500 feet high, was like a beacon to us kids, standing tall against the horizon, whispering promises of high adventure. Our troop was led by Scoutmaster Daniels. It was a tight-knit group of boys from the same neighborhood. Jared Negete, though Jared was the quiet kid, and I'm sure you know the type. Smart and always a little on the outside looking in. He had these thick plastic-rimmed glasses that made his eyes look huge. He was a little heavier than the rest of us, but nobody ever teased him about that. We all liked him. He had this dry sense of humor, the kind that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. Jared was definitely not the loudest, but when he spoke, people would listen. Our whole troop had been buzzing about this trip for weeks upon weeks. Most of us have never hiked anything this big, and I'll admit, I was kind of nervous. But that first night, camping out underneath the stars, all those worries seemed far away. We were huddled around the campfire, the sky above so clear it felt like you could reach out and grab one of the stars in front of you. The air was cool, the fire crackled. We roasted s'mores, laughing and telling stories. Jared mostly stayed quiet, but I caught him smiling, his glasses reflecting the flames. Scoutmaster Daniels had told us to turn in early. There's a big hike tomorrow, he said. I remember the excitement coursing through the group in the moment. We were not going on some ordinary hike anymore. We were going to literally conquer that mountain. It was going to be the highlight of the entire trip. Morning came fast, and I woke to the sound of Scoutmaster Daniels shouting for us to get up. We grabbed a quick bite of oatmeal and apples, packed up our gear, and set off. The plan was simple enough. Hike up to the summit, snap a few photos, and be back at camp by dusk. Sounded easy enough, especially when we were all sitting around the campfire the night before. But once we started that ascent, it became clear this was going to be harder than any of us had ever expected it to be. The first stretch of it really wasn't that bad. We were full of energy, laughing and racing one another along the trail. But as we continued to climb higher, the air thinned and the trees grew sparse. The trail started winding back and forth in these series of switchbacks, each one steeper than the last. The heat, the dust, the thin air, it all weighed down upon us. Jared was struggling more than anybody else. Even at the lower elevations, he definitely would still lag behind. By the time we were a couple of hours in, he was at least a few switchbacks behind us. The scout leaders had to keep calling back to him, reminding him to stay on the trail, to take it slow. We tried to encourage him. Things like, "Come on, Jared, you got this, man." The boys would shout back. "Just a little further, come on." But he wasn't doing well. His face was flushed and he was panting like he just ran a marathon. I'm fine, he just kept saying, waving us off, but he did not look fine. I remember seeing him wipe sweat off his brow, his glasses continuing to slip down his nose. At one point, I fell back just to walk with him. "You okay, Jared?" I asked. He nodded, his breath coming in these short gasps. "Yeah," he said. though I could tell he was just trying to play it off. I just need a minute. I stayed with him for a bit longer, but as the trail got steeper, the rest of the troop started pulling further ahead. Scoutmaster Daniels called out to me. "You keep up with the others now. Jared's got this. We'll make sure he's all right." I hesitated, but nodded and then jogged up to catch with the others. When I looked back, Jared was barely visible, just a small figure in the distance, hunched over, hands on his knees. The summit was closer now. You could feel the excitement radiate through the group as the trail leveled out. The rocky path gave way to a wide clearing that stretched on towards the peak. We all start talking about who would get up there first. "Race you to the top," one of the boys shouted. Before I knew it, we're all sprinting. My lungs were burning, but the sight of the summit filled me with this adrenaline all the way up. I don't remember exactly who reached it first. What I do remember, though, is that view. How the world stretched out beneath us, valleys and forest fading into the horizon. The sky so blue, it hurt to look at. We took out our disposable cameras, snapping pictures of one another, arms raised in victory. It literally felt like we were on top of the world. But then minutes started ticking by. We all looked back down the trail, waiting for Jared to appear. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, nothing. No Jared. Scoutmaster Daniels frowned and mentioned to Mr. Clark, one of the other leaders. "I'm gonna go check on him," he said, pulling on his hat and heading back down the trail. We waited, making some small talk to pass the time, but the mood had definitely shifted now. It was taking too long, and I started getting that knot in my stomach. The one that you get when you know something's not right, something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it yet. Another 10 minutes went by, then 20. Scoutmaster Daniels still hadn't returned. Mr. Clark muttered something underneath his breath and then took off after him. When he finally returned, his face was pale. "He's not on the trail," he said. "What do you mean he's not on the trail?" I asked, my voice sounding small. "I mean he's not there," Mr. Clark replied, his voice tight. "All right, boys, we need to move, now." We scrambled back down the mountain, our boots pounding against that dirt trail. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows throughout the trees, and with every step, that sense of dread grew stronger and stronger. Jared wasn't on the trail. He wasn't anywhere. The leaders called his name over and over again, their voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response. Just the wind rustling through the pines and the crunch of our footsteps. We started checking every offshoot trail, every little path that led away from the main one. Nothing, though. I felt panic bubbling up inside of me, a gnawing fear that maybe he'd taken a wrong turn. Maybe he'd slipped and fallen somewhere. Scoutmaster Daniels then sent half of the group back to base camp, while he and Mr. Clark stayed behind to keep searching. I remember the look on their faces, grim, desperate, like they were trying to stay calm, but they knew they were quickly losing control. When we got back to camp, we still hadn't found him, and that's when the radio came out. I watched Scoutmaster Daniels with his hands shaking, calling for help. One of our scouts is missing," he said. "We need search and rescue up here now, ASAP." The next few hours were kind of a blur in my memory. The search and rescue teams did show up, dozens of them. They scoured the mountains, bringing in dogs, helicopters, everything. The rest of us were told to pack up our things. We weren't staying. It was obviously too dangerous for us kids, especially with the sun now setting. I didn't want to leave. Nobody did. But they herded us back to the cars and took us back home. I didn't sleep a wink that night. All I could think about was Jared, all alone out there in the mountain in the dark. What was he doing? Was he still trying to find his way back? Was he hurt? Was he scared? Days passed, then weeks. Jared did not come home. They found his backpack, some candy wrappers, his camera, nothing else. The pictures on that camera, still get chills thinking about them to this day. Most of them were just shots of the mountainside, blurry landscapes. But that last one was different. They searched for over a week, but never found him. I can still feel the crunch of dirt under my boots from that day in 1991. The way the dry mountain air stung the back of my throat. It was a warm, late summer weekend in early September, and the sky above me in the San Bernardino Mountains was painted a pale, cloudless blue. It seemed like a perfect day for a hike, and that's the thing about the wilderness. Nature has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security before it pulls the rug out right from underneath you. I'd say there was about a dozen Boy Scout troops camped out at the base of the mountain that year. They were all prepping for the day's climb up San Gorgonio, the highest peak in Southern California. Kids from all over the state, ranging from the fresh-faced 11-year-olds to 15-year-olds who thought they had the world already figured out. My troop was from San Diego. We were just one among many. I personally didn't know most of the other boys or their leaders, but when you're out in the wild like that, everybody just looks out for one another. It's an unspoken rule. That's when I first saw Jared, and I didn't think twice about trying to keep him in line. Again, I wasn't part of his troop. He was from a group out of El Monte, a suburb of Los Angeles, but I'd seen him struggling along the trail that morning, lagging behind the others. He was short, kind of heavy set, and clearly not in the best shape for this climb. His face was flushed. He was already sweating buckets before we even hit the steeper parts of the trail. I remember thinking he kind of looked out of place, like a fish out of water. But the kid had something about him, that sort of determination. He wasn't fast or graceful, but he kept going. No matter how much he lagged behind, he just didn't quit. That was refreshing to see. It was the exact kind of tenacity that we were trying to teach all kids. They could do hard things. Half our job was purely encouragement. "Hey, you okay there, bud?" I called out to him when I first noticed how far back he was. I was making sure my own boys were sticking to the trail, handing out snacks back and forth and water, when I saw Jared a good quarter mile behind his own troop. Now, this wasn't uncommon. I've been policing kids here and there on the ascent all day. One kid would fall behind or linger at a rest area too long. I'd get his troop number off his uniform and let them know I was going to tell their scoutmaster. That usually would send them marching right back up the mountain. Jared was different though. He didn't seem to care if he got in trouble, and I could tell right away. He glanced up at me grinning. It was a strange grin, kind of sly, like he knew something that I didn't. He gave me this quick nod, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, then glanced over his shoulder, as if he were expecting somebody to come up from behind him. But when I looked back down the trail, there was nobody else there. Just try to stay with your group," I said, more out of habit than anything. "You really don't want to get separated." He just grinned at me again, gave me this little wave, and then trudged on, his feet kicking up small clouds of dust as he made his way up the slope. There's something about that grin that just stuck with me. It wasn't the look of a kid who was tired or scared. It was almost like he was playing some sort of game, like he was daring somebody to catch him, to say something to him. Dare I say, he seemed like the type to maybe have some form of a bad attitude. The first few miles of the hike went by in a blur. Most of the boys were in pretty good spirits, eager to reach the summit and plant their troop flags at the top. The younger ones were a little slower, but they managed to keep up with the pace. I kept an eye on all of them, offering encouragement whenever somebody looked like they were ready to give up. That trail was steep, but manageable, at least for most of us. I did see Jared a few more times as we made our way up the mountain. Each time he was further and further behind his troop. Each time that same grin plastered along his face. I saw him glance over his shoulder a few times, again as if somebody was following him. But every time I looked back, that trail was empty. I had other kids to get on, and I only saw them once. But Jared was hands down the most consistent face of all the fall behinds. "Come on, Jared," I called out to him when I spotted him for the third time that day. struggling to keep up with his troop. "You're falling behind again, son. You need to stay with your group. It's dangerous. This is the wilderness. If you end up alone, who knows what could happen?" Jared did not answer me, just kept that grin on his face and plodded along. I thought about stopping to talk to him, maybe ask what's going on really. But I had my own boys, and they were getting tired. I had to keep them moving. The fact that I actually said those words to a boy who went missing rattles me to my core. But hey, we really don't know the plans of the future. I never knew this situation would devolve as much as it actually did. The sun was high in the sky by the time we reached that halfway point. We gathered in a small clearing to take a quick break, and I made sure everybody had a water and a snack. Most of the boys were red-faced and sweaty, but still in good spirits, excited to be so close to the summit now. I looked around for Jared, half expecting to see him trailing along behind as usual, but he wasn't there. "Anybody seen Jared? That kid that was lagging behind?" I called out to the other scoutmasters as we sat down to catch our breath. One of them, a tall, wiry guy named Steve from Jared's troop, shook his head. "Last I saw him, he was on the trail. Kid's been dragging his feet all day though." I nodded, but something just didn't sit right with me. I scanned the trail behind us, looking for any sign of him, but the path was empty. You want me to go back and check on him?" I offered. "He might need some help." Steve waved me off. "He's a tough kid, stubborn as hell, I'll admit, but he knows what he's doing. He'll catch up eventually." I wasn't so sure, but I didn't argue. Jared wasn't my responsibility technically. My own boys were, and they were starting to get restless now. We had a schedule to keep. I couldn't afford to fall behind. Just as I was letting myself get all worried, I looked back and sure enough, there he is, hoofing it up behind us. He was red and covered in sweat, but he kept putting one foot in front of the other. The last time that I looked at him, he peeked over his shoulder once more. Now I was really wondering what the hell he could be looking at. Maybe he was just getting random samples of the view being up so high, but I pressed on with my scouts onward, whittled that hike down to its last mile or two. We started that final stretch to the summit, I'd say maybe an hour later. The trail was steeper now, the switchbacks winding their way up the side of the mountain, and the boys were struggling to keep up the pace. I kept them moving as best I could, but my mind would occasionally drift back to Jared. I hadn't seen him since that last break, and something about his absence just continued to gnaw at me. Then about a half mile from the summit, I saw him again. He was pretty far below us and moving down the mountain now, and not up. At first, I thought maybe I was seeing things, but as I watched, I realized that was definitely Jared. He was not on the trail anymore. He was cutting across switchbacks, sliding down the steep rocky slope like he was in a hurry to get back to camp.
"Jared!"
I shouted out, cupping my hands around my mouth.
"What are you doing? Get back up here!"
He didn't even look up at me. He just kept moving, sliding between the rocks, taking a shortcut that no sane person would attempt. We had very specific rules in place to prevent that kind of stuff from happening, and number one being, stay on the trail. This is no shit a mountain, so sliding around on it at all is a potential death sentence. Just a little change in steepness and you might be rocketing right into your grave. We had this rule because the trail itself is littered with switchbacks, so it's tempting to want to take shortcuts in between them. And that's exactly what Jared was doing. He was maybe 3/4 of a mile behind us, but he was almost directly below us on the trail. I stood for a moment, torn between going after him and staying with my troop. We were so close to the summit now. The other scoutmasters were just ahead of me. I figured one of them would catch up with Jared and get him back on track. After all, he really couldn't have gone far. Ultimately, I decided to push on, let his scoutmaster know, as I had my own troop to worry about. But my gut was still twisting, and something just didn't feel right. "Stay here," I told my assistant scoutmaster, a young guy named Matt, before turning and jogging back down the trail after Jared. I'll be right back." By the time I reached the spot where I'd last seen him, Jared was gone. The trail below was empty. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. I called his name again, but there's no answer. Definitely not good, but hell, I was watching him go downhill. Of course he wasn't here. That's when those first tendrils of fear started creeping up my spine. I hurried back to the top as my heart raced. I found Steve and the other leaders gathered at the summit. They were all relaxing, the boys huddled around the small fire, chatting excitedly about the climb. Felt like I was about to shake their world up, but we needed to get moving down the mountain if we were going to catch that kid. "Hey," I said breathless as I approached. I saw Jared heading back down. He was sliding between the switchbacks. Did any of you see him? Steve frowned, glancing at the other scoutmasters. "No, I haven't seen him this afternoon at all. Are you sure that was him?" "I'm positive," I said. "He was going downhill, taking these shortcuts between the rocks. I called out to him, but he just ignored me." Steve cursed underneath his breath. "Damn it. I swear that kid never listens. I'll head back down and see if I can catch him. He probably just got spooked or tired. Which shortcut was it?" "The one sliding between the switchbacks," I answered. "Haha, damn it," was all Steve said. He told his troop to gather their stuff and prepare to hike back to base camp. Since my troop had just arrived, we hung back for a bit, enjoyed the view in the fading sunlight, and just continued to rest. I watched as Steve shouldered his pack and set off down the trail, his figure quickly disappearing into the trees. The rest of us just stayed at the summit for a while, hoping he'd find his missing Boy Scout and everything would be fine. The rest of his troop marched along behind him, looking in all directions for any signs of Jared. I'd say less than a half an hour would pass and then we were all on our trip back to camp. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I tried to keep my boys occupied, singing songs and playing I Spy, all kinds of trail entertainment, but my mind kept drifting back to Jared. What the hell was this kid? Why the hell did he ignore me? It all felt super weird and I was just glad to get a scoutmaster involved finally. As we descended, we could see the other group well ahead of us, but because they were looking around, we were starting to gain on them. By the time we caught up with Steve, it was nearly dark. His face was now grim, and he shook his head before I even had the chance to ask him. All of his assistant scoutmasters looked just as frazzled, and I quickly came to realize that this troop was at a total loss. It was like we walked up on a bunch of ghosts. They shined their flashlights this way and that, calling out, but never hearing anything in return. "Couldn't find him," he said quietly. "I followed the trail all the way back to camp, but there's no sign of him. It's literally like he vanished." Panic surged through me. "Did you check those shortcuts? He wasn't on the trail when I saw him. He was cutting between the switchbacks." Steve nodded. "I looked everywhere. No footprints, no sign of him at all. It's like he disappeared into thin air." "And you made it all the way to the bottom?" I clarified. "Yeah, all the way down and then all the way back. Nothing. And he isn't at camp." We all went in a double time, as safely as we could, and crash landed into our respective base camp, all the while letting other Boy Scout troops know there was a situation at hand. Other troops started getting little teams together to roam the foothills and shine lights up towards the mountain trail, as a guide if he was potentially up there. Or Steve had to go make the call. The guy hiked 5 miles through the pitch black to reach the nearest park ranger station, notify the emergency services. The search began that night, and word spread quickly throughout the camp. I'd say within an hour, every single available adult was combing the mountainside. All the flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices calling out Jared's name. All the boys were kept at camp, huddled inside their tents, but I could see the fear in their eyes. As the night wore on, that feeling kept getting worse and worse. Something was wrong. Jared wasn't just lost, he's gone. And no one knew where, and no one knew why. When the professional search and rescue teams arrived, they scoured the area for any sign of Jared. They found a single boot print that matched his size, but nothing else really. No other footprints, no gear, nothing but the mountains and the endless empty sky. Then, on the third day, that's when they found his camera. He was lying in a shallow ravine, half buried under a pile of rocks. The film inside had been exposed, but they managed to salvage a few photos, most of which were the surrounding wilderness, trees, rocks, the distant mountains. But the last one was of Jared. It was a close-up of his face, taken in the dark. His eyes were wide, his expression confused, almost frightened. That photo sent a chill down my spine. And still to this day, that is the last trace of Jared anybody has found. When the call came in about Jared, I didn't think much of it. These things happen all the time, especially in the mountains and especially with kids. I'd been a volunteer search and rescue operator for almost 15 years at this point, and most of the time it was routine. A lost hiker, or a kid who wandered off, or somebody who underestimated the difficulty of the trail at hand. Usually you'd find them within a few hours, maybe a day at most. They'd be shaken, but okay. They'd have a story to tell, and we'd have a job well done. But Jared was different. I remember driving up those winding roads that weekend. The sun was already sinking low behind the mountain peaks. The sky was that hazy orange that makes everything look almost unreal. And I had this odd feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was just the altitude, or maybe it was the way the radio had crackled alive when the dispatcher relayed those details. But I did feel off. I brushed it aside though. This was gonna be a simple job. The kid goes missing in the woods, we find him, everybody goes home. That's how it's supposed to work. When I arrived at the staging area, there was already a few teams getting their gear together. Jared's scout troop had wasted no time calling us in, which was a good sign. The kid hadn't been missing for that long, only maybe a few hours, and the terrain itself wasn't too bad. The trail system in this part of the San Bernardino Mountains was pretty well mapped and well known. It wasn't some dense, unforgiving wilderness. This was a place families hiked on the weekends. We all figured it'd be pretty hard for a person to get truly lost out here. It's open, with clear paths, and most of the trails loop back on themselves or led to the same area. Jared's troop had been hiking up to the summit, a pretty big climb for a 12-year-old, but I guess it wasn't too dangerous. The plan was to summit and then head back down to camp before dark. Simple enough. But somehow Jared had slipped through the cracks. One minute he's there, and the next he's not. It didn't make sense, at least not at first. As we continued to organize the search, I couldn't help but feel a growing frustration toward these scoutmasters. These kids are their responsibility, and yet somehow they managed to lose one. I talked to a few of them and their stories were all over the place. One of them, a tall guy with graying hair, just kept shaking his head, like he couldn't believe what happened. "We were all together," he insisted. He was lagging behind, but we kept checking on him. He was fine. "Okay, and how far behind was he?" I asked, trying my best to keep the irritation out of my voice. "A few hundred yards, maybe," the scoutmaster said, looking at the ground. "We told him to stay with the group, but he trailed off, his face pale. He just kept falling back." I bit back a retort. A few hundred yards? That was too far, way too far, especially for a kid at his age, especially for a kid at 11,000 feet. The elevation alone could mess with you. The trail was steep. No way should he have been allowed to lag that far behind without somebody sticking with him. "Okay, and then what?" I pressed. "What happened next?" The scoutmaster shrugged helplessly. "We got to the summit and we turned around and he was gone. We thought maybe, just maybe, he'd gone back down to camp. We sent somebody after him, but..." He didn't finish his sentence, and he didn't have to. That was the last time anybody saw Jared Negete. Just like that, a kid vanished. The initial feeling among the search team was cautiously optimistic. After all, it hadn't been that long since he went missing, and the weather was good. We figured he'd wandered off the trail, maybe took some kind of wrong turn. We'd find him soon enough. But the hours ticked by, and the sun sank lower in the sky, and things started to feel different. The first few hours of searching turned up nothing. No footprints, no dropped gear, no sign of Jared anywhere. It was almost like the mountain had swallowed him whole. The scoutmasters were a complete mess, pacing around, muttering to one another in low voices. One of them, a younger guy with this nervous twitch, started talking about mountain lions. There's been attacks in this area before, he said, wringing his hands. A kid this size, he could have been dragged off. But there was no blood or sign of a struggle. If Jared had indeed been attacked by an animal, we would have definitely seen something, tracks, fur, anything. But there was nothing. Another theory started floating around, one that actually made my skin crawl. Some of the searchers wondered if Jared actually hadn't wandered off. Maybe somebody had taken him. Maybe he'd been kidnapped or worse. I didn't want to believe it, but the idea lodged itself in my brain and wouldn't let go. A boy just doesn't disappear into thin air. The first few days of that search were a blur of frustration and exhaustion. We combed that mountain, grid searching every inch of the trails, calling Jared's name until our voices were hoarse. We found nothing. Well, almost nothing. On the second day, somebody found a single boot print, half buried in the dirt near a switchback. It did indeed match the size of Jared's shoes, but that was it. No more tracks, no more trail to follow, just a lonely print. Then on the third day, we found the camera. It was an old disposable one, the kind that kids use on school trips. It was lying in the dirt near a rock slide, and when we picked it up, we knew it was his. The thing was busted, but we managed to get the film developed. I wasn't there when they looked at the photos, but I heard about it later. Most of the pictures were what you'd expect. Shots of the mountains, trees, the sky. Just a kid fooling around with the camera. The last picture was different. It was a close-up of Jared's face, taken in the dark. His eyes were wide, his expression confused, scared even. The shot was blurry, like it had been taken in a hurry, but no one knew what to make of it. Some of the searchers started to whisper that maybe the boy hadn't been alone when that picture was taken. Maybe somebody or something had been with him. By this point, law enforcement had gotten involved. They started questioning the campers in the area, trying to piece together anything that might help us figure out where Jared had gone. Most of the campers hadn't seen or heard anything out of the ordinary, but there was one group that told a story that gives some of us nightmares. They were camped out on the opposite side of the mountain, I'd say a mile from where Jared actually disappeared. According to them, they'd seen something that night, just around sunset. At first, they thought it was a man, lurking around the edges of their camp, but as it got darker, they realized it wasn't a man. It was far too tall, and whatever it was wasn't wearing clothes. Now, keep in mind, this is their description. They described it as some kind of creature with long limbs and pale skin. It didn't make any noise, just stood there watching. They tried to scare it off by shouting, throwing rocks, waving burning sticks, but it never moved, just stood there staring. Eventually, it wandered off into the woods, and they thought, well, okay, that was the end of it. But later that night, they heard something out in the distance. Strange sounds like somebody or something was still moving through the trees. Then came the screams. The campers said they heard the screams of a child echoing through the mountains, the same direction that creature had gone. They didn't know what to do, so they just stayed in their tents, terrified until morning. When they found out about Jared, they went straight to the ranger station to report what they'd heard and seen, but by then it was far too late. Now I know what you're thinking, but that story did stick with me as the search dragged on. Every time we went out into the woods calling out Jared's name, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The air felt heavy, like something was watching us from the trees, but we had a job to do. I tried to just focus on the task at hand. After a week of searching, we were all getting desperate. The chances of finding Jared alive now were very slim. We all knew it. But I did have a theory, one that I hadn't shared with anybody yet. I've been slowly piecing it together in my head. ever since I heard that Scoutmasters talking about Jared had been sliding down those switchbacks. It wasn't uncommon for kids to do that, cutting across the trail to save some time. This mountain is different. Those switchbacks were steep. If you weren't careful, you could easily lose control and tumble down the slope. I knew the area well and had a hunch about where Jared actually might have gone. There was this canyon at the base of the mountain, about a mile from the last place that he'd been seen. It was overgrown, wild, with no trails leading to it. If Jared had slid down one too many switchbacks, he could have easily ended up in that canyon. And if he did, he's probably already dead. I decided to check it out for myself. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, just grabbed my gear and headed for the switchbacks. When I got there, I stood at the top looking down at those steep, rocky slopes. It wasn't too hard to imagine a kid like Jared losing his footing here, especially in the fading light. I followed that trail down for a mile, even tried the sliding trick myself. It was dangerous, but it worked, at least for a while. Then I came to the edge of the canyon. It was just as I remembered. Wild, overgrown, completely cut off from the rest of the mountain. Jared had indeed gone down here, nobody would have seen him, and nobody would have found him. I radioed in my location and then made my way down into the canyon, all the while calling out his name. But I knew it was pointless. That canyon was far too big and wild. If he was ever here, he was now long gone. And the reality was, he actually might have gone down into there confidently. There are game trails you can see from the top that might actually look like a main trail in the fading light. I think Jared slid right by the trail that he was supposed to stay on, accidentally redirected himself in the wrong direction. While he descended into the canyon, the real trail arched the other way toward camp. Now, all of this is just a theory, but it makes more sense than the others. After that, they brought in helicopters with infrared cameras, but nothing. The search went on for 19 days total, and Jared was never found. I still think about him sometimes, especially when I'm out in those mountains. I think about that camera, about that last picture that he took. I think about those other campers and the thing that they quote-unquote saw. I wonder, did we miss something? Did we overlook something in those woods? Something we weren't supposed to see? Or was it something else? Something we'll never understand. All I know is that Jared walked into those mountains and he never came back. Rest in peace, kid.